The scent of freshly cut grass, usually a balm to Arthur's soul, now curdled into the bitter tang of betrayal. For 20 years, the Hedges had stood as guardians of his peace, a vibrant, verdant barrier against the prying eyes of the neighborhood, and more specifically, against the relentless scrutiny of Brenda Carmichael. His hedges, not just shrubs, but a living testament to patience, growth, and the quiet beauty of privacy. He'd known trouble was brewing. Brenda, the self-appointed queen of the Cypress Creek Homeowners Association, had made it her personal crusade to enforce an archaic bylaw concerning uniform landscaping. His hedges, a robust 10 feet tall, were deemed excessive and a visual obstruction to her meticulously manicured rose garden directly across the street. Absurd. His hedges had been there long before her prize-winning hybrid teas. The first, Volley, was a passive-aggressive note, left tucked under his wiper blade. Dear resident, a friendly reminder that all greenery exceeding 7 feet requires immediate trimming per Section 4B, Article 3 of the HOA Covenants. Your cooperation is appreciated. No signature, but the crisp linen paper and the ornate cursive screamed, Brenda. Arthur, a man of quiet routine and a deep aversion to unnecessary confrontation, had tried to comply. He'd trimmed a foot off, then another. The hedges now stood, at a respectable 8 feet, still a good foot above Brenda's dictated limit, but significantly reduced from their former glory. He thought that would be enough, a compromise, a gesture of good faith. He was wrong. The next communication arrived. Via certified mail, a formal violation notice. The HOA letterhead, heavy and official, detailed a fine of $50 per day until the offense was remedied. It cited his continued non-compliance. Brenda's name, as HOA president, was printed neatly below the signature line. Arthur scoffed. $50 a day? For Hedges? He called the HOA office, a number that connected him directly to Brenda's personal cell phone, a fact she never bothered to disguise. Cypress Creek HOA, Brenda Carmichael speaking. Her voice was like perfectly chilled white wine, crisp, a little sharp, and utterly lacking warmth. Brenda, it's Arthur Vance. About this violation notice. Ah, Mr. Vance, yes, your hedges. Still non-compliant, I see. Her tone was annoyingly saccharine. I trimmed them, Brenda. They're down to 8 feet. That's a significant reduction. The bylaw states 7 feet, Mr. Vance. 7. Not 8, not 9, not 10, and certainly not your unruly previous height. The word unruly was delivered with a sniff of disdain, as if his hedges were teenage delinquents. Brenda, these hedges were here when I bought this house 20 years ago, before the HOA even thought of that ridiculous 7-foot rule for new plantings. They're established. Arthur felt his patience fraying. The covenants apply to all residents, Mr. Vance, new and old. Equality, you understand. And frankly, her voice dropped conspiratorially, though he knew she was performing for an imagined audience. They block the morning sun from my prize-winning Crimson Glory roses. They need full sun, you know. Arthur bit back a frustrated retort about her roses not being his problem. Look, Brenda, I'm willing to trim another 6 inches, but anything more and I risk damaging them. They're old, mature plants. The rule is 7 feet, Mr. Vance. The HOA will take action if necessary. The line clicked dead. He stewed for days, the fine accumulating. He considered a countersuit, but the thought of legal battles, the time, the expense, the sheer exhaustion of it all weighed him down. Arthur was a librarian, a man who cherished order and quiet, not a warrior. He was on the verge of giving in, of surrendering his beloved green wall, when the sound began. It was a Tuesday morning, typically the most peaceful day in Cypress Creek. Arthur was sipping his coffee, engrossed in a rare first edition, when the deep, guttural roar of a gas-powered hedge trimmer shattered the tranquility, then another and another, a whole symphony of destruction. He rushed to the window. His blood ran cold. Two burly men in generic landscaping uniforms stood on his property line, their powerful machines tearing into his hedges. But they weren't trimming. They were shearing. Great swaths of green, thick branches, entire sections of his 20-year legacy, fell to the ground like casualties of war. They weren't just cutting it to 7 feet, they were annihilating it. To the bare stumps. Brenda stood on her sidewalk, arms crossed, a smug, triumphant smirk plastered across her face. She gestured, an imperious queen directing her executioners. One of the landscapers, a beefy man with a stained shirt, even gave her a nod and a thumbs up. Arthur threw open his front door, his voice raw. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" The landscapers paused, their faces impassive. One pointed to a clipboard. "HOA directive, sir. Non-compliant hedges. We've been instructed to remove them." "Remove them? You're destroying them. These are my hedges." Brenda's voice, surprisingly loud and clear across the street, cut through the din. "They were non-compliant, Mr. Vance. After numerous warnings, the HOA was left with no choice but to enforce the covenants. This is on you." His gaze locked with hers. Her eyes, usually just cold, now glittered with a malicious satisfaction. She hadn't just wanted compliance. She had wanted humiliation. She wanted his sanctuary gone. He stood there helpless, watching. The green fall. The air filled with the acrid smell of lacerated wood and diesel fumes. The roar of the machines devoured his shouts, his pleas, his impotent rage. Within minutes, where a vibrant living wall had stood, there was now only a jagged line of pathetic bleeding stumps barely 2 feet high. The morning sun, previously filtered and soft, now glared directly into his living room, harsh and unforgiving, exposing everything. When they were done, the landscapers piled the debris onto their trailer, leaving behind a battlefield of broken branches and trampled earth. Brenda watched them drive away, then turned to her roses, watering them with a delicate, almost loving hand. She didn't spare him another glance. Arthur walked out to the wasteland that was once his privacy. He ran a hand over a splintered stump, the rough wood a stark contrast to the soft leaves it once bore. He felt hollowed out, violated. But beneath the profound sense of loss, a new emotion began to simmer, slow and dangerous. It wasn't despair. It was a cold, hard resolve. He stared at the exposed side of his house, at Brenda's perfectly symmetrical rose garden, at the street now laid bare. And in that moment, a vision formed in his mind. Not of hedges, not of soft green, but of something impenetrable, something unyielding, something that would block out the sun for Brenda's roses, for Brenda herself, for every prying eye in Cypress Creek. A wall, a fortress, and it wouldn't be trimmed. The raw, exposed earth where his hedges once stood felt like an open wound. Arthur Vance stood there for a long time, the afternoon sun beating down, no longer filtered by the comforting green. His usual placid demeanor had evaporated, replaced by a cold, simmering fury. He was no warrior, he'd told himself, but what was a man supposed to do when his home, his peace, his very privacy was brutally invaded? Brenda Carmichael had crossed a line, a thick, indelible one. He had envisioned a wall, a fortress, and now the abstract notion began to solidify into concrete plans, literally. That evening, the internet became his battlefield. Arthur, who usually delved into historical archives and rare literary texts, now plunged into forums on zoning laws, property rights, and, ironically, HOA covenants. He devoured local ordinances, building codes, and even obscure legal precedents regarding fences and boundary disputes. He learned about setbacks, height, restrictions for various structures, and the difference between decorative walls and privacy fences. He discovered a critical loophole. While the HOA had draconian rules about landscaping, their covenants were surprisingly vague and limited regarding permanent structures like fences, particularly those made of masonry, which fell under city. Building codes, not HOA landscaping rules. His mind, accustomed to cataloging and cross-referencing information, worked with ruthless efficiency. He sketched designs, calculated dimensions, and researched materials. Cinder blocks. They were cheap, ugly, and undeniably effective. They offered absolute privacy, and unlike living hedges, they couldn't be trimmed. The following morning, Arthur called the city's planning department, posing as a hypothetical homeowner. He meticulously confirmed the maximum height for a boundary wall without requiring a special permit, 8 feet, in his district. He verified that cinder block construction was permitted as long as it was within his property line and met structural integrity standards. He double-checked the HOA's bylaws, finding no explicit mention of masonry walls, only fences made of approved materials, wood, vinyl, wrought iron, up to 6 feet. His fort would be masonry, and it would be 8 feet. A wall, not a fence. A crucial distinction. By noon, a parade of heavy-duty vehicles began to arrive at Arthur's usually quiet cul-de-sac. First, a flatbed truck groaned under the weight of hundreds of gray cinder blocks, each one a silent, defiant brick of vengeance. Then a smaller truck carrying bags of concrete mix, sand, and bags of rebar. The deliveries were strategically placed, not hidden, but lined up along what used to be his hedge line, a clear declaration of intent. Neighbors peered through their curtains. Their morning routines momentarily paused. Mrs. Henderson, a sweet, elderly woman from 2 doors down, waved nervously from her porch. Mr. Jenkins, the perpetually grilling enthusiast, paused mid-flip of his bacon, his jaw slack. Whispers started rippling through Cypress Creek, a suburban echo chamber that usually hummed with gossip about garden club politics and holiday light displays. Now, the topic was Arthur Vance and his rapidly transforming property. Across the street, Brenda Carmichael's reaction was delayed, but spectacular. She'd spent the morning preening over her newly sun-drenched roses, basking in the victory of her vanquished foe. When the first delivery truck rumbled past her window, she merely frowned, assuming it was for the new family down the street. But as the cinder blocks began to stack up on Arthur's lawn, an icy dread began to creep up her spine. She marched out, hands on her hips, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair vibrating with indignation. "Mr. Vance, what is the meaning of this?" Her voice, usually so precise, cracked with disbelief. Arthur, who was carefully stacking a row of blocks near his property line, wiped sweat from his brow. He wore old jeans and a faded t-shirt, looking less like a librarian and more like a man on a mission. He didn't even look up. "Meaning of what, Brenda?" he asked, his voice deliberately calm, almost bored. These blocks, what are you building?" Her eyes darted from the stacks of gray, rough-hewn concrete to the remnants of his hedges. He finally straightened, meeting her gaze. His eyes, usually mild, now held a glint of steel. "A wall, Brenda. A privacy wall. Since my hedges, which provided 20 years of perfectly adequate privacy, were deemed unruly and summarily executed, I decided to replace them with something a little more permanent," Brenda sputtered. "A wall? You can't build a wall! It's against the covenants!" "Oh?" Arthur leaned against a stack of blocks, crossing his arms. "Which covenant, Brenda? The one about uniform landscaping? Because this isn't landscaping. It's a permanent structure. Building code issue, really. And I've already checked with the city. 8 feet. No permit needed as long as it's on my property line, which it is." He gestured to a series of neatly strung lines he'd laid out with stakes, outlining the exact boundary. Brenda's face turned a mottled shade of red. She prided herself on knowing every HOA rule, every loophole, every clause. The thought that Arthur, meek, Arthur Vance might have outmaneuvered her was an unbearable insult. This is an eyesore. It will devalue the entire neighborhood. It's industrial. It's a blight, she shrieked, her voice rising to a pitch that made Mr. Jenkins nearly drop his spatula. Blight? Arthur raised an eyebrow. Like chopped down bear, stumps in place of a beautiful hedge? Or perhaps like a relentless HOA president who unilaterally decides to destroy a man's property. His voice remained level, but each word was a carefully aimed dart. I was enforcing the rules. And I, Arthur countered, am building a wall to protect my privacy. A right, I believe, still afforded to homeowners in this country, even in Cypress Creek. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Arthur, with a newfound focus, rented a cement mixer and donned work gloves. He learned to mix concrete, to lay mortar beds, to level blocks with a spirit level. His hands, once accustomed to turning, delicate book pages grew calloused and strong. The wall grew, course by course, a relentless gray monument to his defiance. Each block laid was a direct answer to Brenda's petty tyranny, a physical manifestation of his refusal to be intimidated. Neighbors continued to watch, some with thinly veiled amusement, others with a mix of awe and trepidation. A few brave souls even offered encouragement. Young Timmy, the paper boy, stopped to ask what he was building. A fort, Arthur replied with a rare, grim smile. Brenda, meanwhile, was in a frenzy. She called emergency HOA meetings, consulted with their lawyer, who, much to her chagrin, confirmed Arthur was likely within his rights regarding a masonry wall on his own property, and even tried to rally other neighbors against him, but most were either amused or too intimidated by Arthur's quiet resolve to side with her. One afternoon, as the wall reached its sixth course, a new vehicle pulled up. Not landscapers this time, but a sleek black sedan with an official HOA emblem on the door. Out stepped Brenda, flanked by two other HOA board members, Mr. Davies, a nervous-looking accountant, and Mrs. Gable, a stern woman who usually just rubber-stamped Brenda's decisions. Brenda held a fresh stack of papers, her eyes, narrowed to slits, fixed on the rapidly rising gray behemoth. "Mr. Vance," she declared, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage, "this structure is in direct violation of newly proposed HOA guidelines for aesthetics and harmonious community appearance." She thrust a document at him. "The board has just approved an emergency amendment. All new exterior walls must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee, and this clearly would never be approved." Arthur took the papers, barely glancing at them. He knew she was desperate, fabricating rules as she went. He looked directly at her, then at the two hesitant board members behind her. "Brenda," he said, his voice quiet but resonating with an undeniable authority, "that amendment was passed after I began construction, and it pertains to new exterior walls. This wall is already underway. Furthermore, the city building codes supersede your emergency aesthetic guidelines. You have no jurisdiction here." He paused, then added, his gaze sweeping over the burgeoning wall, "And even if you did, Brenda, you just chopped down my hedges. What did you expect? Me to do? Plant more flowers?" His words hung in the air, a challenge, a quiet promise of a battle she had only just begun. Brenda Carmichael stood frozen, the emergency amendment clutched in her hand, her face a mask of furious disbelief. Arthur's quiet defiance, his utter refusal to be cowed, was a poison seeping into her carefully constructed world of order and control. Mr. Davies fidgeted behind her. Mrs. Gable stared at her shoes, both acutely aware of the shift in power dynamics. Arthur had not only outmaneuvered Brenda, he had publicly exposed her desperation. "This isn't over, Mr. Vance," Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking with fury. "The HOA has resources. You will regret this." Arthur merely offered a small, unsettling smile. "I imagine we'll see, Brenda." He turned back to his work, the rhythmic thud of a cinder block settling into mortar sounding like a drumbeat of war. The next few days in Cypress Creek were a masterclass in passive-aggressive warfare. Brenda couldn't legally halt construction, but she certainly tried to make Arthur's life a living hell. The HOA began sending daily courtesy notices about minor infractions: a misplaced recycling bin, a speck of dirt on his driveway, the unauthorized storage of building materials on his property, even though the blocks were neatly stacked and his property was clearly demarcated. Each notice came with a new, escalating fine. Arthur simply filed them in a growing stack, unmoved. Then came the community watch patrols. Brenda, in her pristine golf cart, would slowly drive by Arthur's house, sometimes 2 or 3 times an hour, her eyes narrowed, scrutinizing his every move. She'd bring friends, ostensibly for a tour of the neighborhood, but their route always included a prolonged stop across from Arthur's ever-growing wall. They'd whisper, point, and occasionally Brenda would let out a theatrical sigh of dismay. Arthur endured it with a stoic calm that bordered on unnerving. He had entered a state of focused determination, his previous mildness replaced by an almost zen-like resolve. He put up a large "No Trespassing" sign near the wall and installed a motion-activated security camera pointed directly at his front yard and property line. He worked methodically, mixing concrete in the morning cool, laying blocks through the heat of the day, and meticulously cleaning his tools in the evening. The wall was nearly 8 feet high now, a formidable gray barrier stretching the entire length of his front yard, effectively shielding his house from the street and, crucially, from Brenda's gaze. The neighborhood, initially amused, now felt the tension. Some homeowners started leaving small gifts on Arthur's porch: a cold lemonade, a plate of cookies, even a pair of sturdy work gloves. Mrs. Henderson often waved from her porch, a silent sign of support. Not everyone was siding with Brenda, much to her exasperation. Brenda, however, was not one to be easily deterred. Her inability to stop the wall was festering, turning her frustration into a dangerous obsession. She couldn't attack the wall directly, but she could attack Arthur's finances. One morning, Arthur found a new, official-looking envelope in his mailbox. This wasn't an HOA notice. It was from the city. He tore it open. It was a cease and desist order from the City Planning and Zoning Department. The reason: a complaint about a non-permitted, uninspected masonry structure that was potentially unsafe and a violation of public nuisance ordinances. The complaint specifically mentioned a missing rebar inspection and inadequate foundation depth. It demanded immediate cessation of work and a full structural review by a licensed engineer, along with a hefty fine for non-compliance. Arthur felt a chill. This wasn't Brenda's usual HOA bluster. This was official from the city itself. Someone had filed a formal, detailed complaint, clearly knowing the technicalities of building codes. He knew exactly who. Brenda had found a new angle, a new weapon. She had gone to the city, probably fabricating details, knowing that the city, bureaucracy, would act on a technical complaint, even a frivolous one. He pulled out his original building code notes. He had researched every detail. He had installed rebar, and he had ensured the foundation was dug to the proper depth. The city's complaint was either based on false information or a misunderstanding. But fighting City Hall was a different beast than fighting the HOA. This meant permits, inspections, possibly tearing down parts of the wall for structural review. This was the expense and the exhaustion he had initially dreaded. He called the number on the cease and desist. It connected him to a stern-voiced woman named Ms. Albright in the zoning department. She informed him in clipped tones that the complaint was serious and that all work must stop immediately. An inspector would be dispatched within 48 hours. Any further work would result in further fines and possible demolition orders. Arthur hung up, his jaw tight. Brenda had indeed gone for the jugular. She wasn't just trying to annoy him anymore. She was trying to bankrupt him and force him to tear down his hard-won fortress. He walked out to the nearly finished wall, running his hand over the rough concrete. It felt solid, impregnable. but now it was under threat from an entirely different adversary. He looked across the street. Brenda was on her porch, watering her roses. She caught his eye, and for the first time, a genuine malicious smile spread across her face. It wasn't the smug smirk of victory. It was the cruel delight of inflicting pain. She raised her watering can in a mock toast. Arthur didn't react. He stood there, staring at the gray wall, at the city notice in his hand, and at Brenda's triumphant gaze. He had built his fortress. Now he had to defend it. Not just from Brenda, but from the entire system she was now manipulating. His quiet life had been shattered, and in its place, a full-blown war was raging. He knew what he had to do. He had to prove her lies, and he had to do it before the city came with their bulldozers. The city's cease and desist order was not merely a piece of paper. It was a gauntlet thrown. Arthur Vance knew this wasn't Brenda Carmichael's usual HOA-fueled temper tantrum. This was a bureaucratic machine, slow but relentless, and designed to crush individual defiance. He had to act fast, and he had to be smarter. His quiet life as a librarian had hardly prepared him for a showdown with City Hall, but the Cinder Block Fortress was more than just a wall. It was a symbol of his reclaimed peace, and he wasn't about to surrender it. His first move was to gather his evidence. He went through his meticulous notes from his initial research, screenshots of city code sections, printouts of maximum wall heights, and detailed diagrams of proper foundation depth and rebar spacing. He'd even taken photographs of his progress, albeit amateur ones, documenting each stage of the wall's construction. He remembered the precise measurements he'd taken, the careful leveling, the amount of concrete he'd mixed. He had followed the rules, even the unspoken ones of structural integrity. The next day, Arthur drove to the City Planning and Zoning Department, a bland, monolithic building that felt designed to induce submission. The waiting room was filled with frustrated citizens, all caught in various tangles of red tape. When his number was finally called, he found himself in front of Ms. Albright, the woman with the clipped tone from his phone call. She was a formidable figure, her sharp eyes magnified by thick-rimmed glasses, her desk meticulously organized. "Mr. Vance," she began, without preamble, her voice as dry as old parchment, "we have received a complaint regarding your masonry structure. It alleges several significant code violations, including insufficient foundation and improper rebar installation. These are serious safety concerns." Arthur placed his binder on her desk. "Ms. Albright, I assure you, the structure is sound and built entirely to code. I have here a detailed record of my construction process, including measurements, materials used, and even photographs." Ms. Albright barely glanced at the binder. "Mr. Vance, without proper permits and inspections at each critical stage, foundation, rebar, final. We cannot verify your claims. The complaint is quite specific. Frankly, without engineering plans stamped by a licensed professional, this wall is considered unauthorized and potentially unsafe." I understood from my initial research that a wall of this height didn't require a permit, Arthur pressed. "For a simple garden wall, perhaps. But a structure of this length and solidity, built to 8 feet, especially given the nature of the complaint, warrants stricter scrutiny. The complaint specifically highlights that the wall appears to be more than a simple decorative element." Her gaze flickered to the nature of the complaint section on her screen, a subtle implication that someone had given them very specific information. "Brenda, so what are my options?" Arthur asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "You can apply for an after-the-fact permit, which will entail submitting full engineering plans, having the existing structure inspected, which may involve drilling core samples or excavating around the foundation, and if any discrepancies are found, you will be required to bring it up to code. This will incur significant fines for the permit violation and potential demolition costs if it's deemed irreparable. Or you can voluntarily demolish the structure within 30 days to avoid further penalties." The words drilling core samples and excavating around the foundation hit Arthur hard. It meant defacing his wall, potentially weakening it, and certainly incurring massive costs for engineers and contractors. Brenda hadn't just made a complaint, she had crafted a trap designed to be both financially ruinous and emotionally devastating. And, if I refuse either option? Ms. Albright leaned forward, her voice dropping slightly, but losing none of its steel. Then the city will issue a demolition order, and we will levy the costs of removal, disposal, and any associated legal fees directly against your property. Believe me, Mr. Vance, those costs will far exceed any fines. Arthur's mind raced. He had built the wall correctly. He knew he had. But proving it without permits and professional certifications seemed impossible. He was trapped. Demolition would be a complete surrender, an admission of defeat to Brenda. The cost of a full engineering review and after-the-fact permits felt prohibitive for a librarian's salary. He left Ms. Albright's office feeling a profound sense of despair. He hadn't experienced even when Brenda's landscapers shredded his hedges. That had been a direct attack, and he'd built a defense. This was an indirect, systemic attack, insidious and overwhelming. He spent the next few days in a haze, the cease and desist order taped to his refrigerator a constant, mocking reminder. He re-examined his notes, walked the perimeter of his wall, even contemplated simply ignoring the city, but the threat of liens and forced demolition was too dire. He felt the weight of Brenda's victory pressing down on him. She had found his breaking point. One evening, staring blankly at the wall from his living room, now fully obscured from the street, he noticed something, a small detail he'd overlooked in his initial rage. The concrete. He had used a specific type of high-strength mix, chosen for its durability. And when he'd mixed it, he hadn't just guessed. He had followed the precise water-to-cement ratio, recommended by the manufacturer. More than that, he'd kept the empty bags, meticulous as he was, in his garage. Each bag had a batch number, a date stamp, and manufacturer specifications. And then a memory surfaced from his extensive research into building codes. For certain types of non-load-bearing masonry structures under a specific height, if materials could be verified and construction methods could be reasonably demonstrated, a waiver for a full structural engineering review might be granted by the chief building inspector, often based on circumstantial evidence if no professional license was initially required. It was a long shot, a rarely used clause, but it was a shot. It meant proving his integrity not just with words, but with irrefutable physical evidence. It meant going over Ms. Albright's head. The inspector was scheduled to arrive tomorrow morning. Arthur knew he had only a few hours. He hurried to his garage, pulling out the stacked empty concrete bags. He checked the dates, the batch numbers. Then he found his old digital camera, the one he'd used years ago to photograph rare book bindings, and began taking new, detailed photos of the wall. The visible rebar at the top course, the smooth, even mortar lines, the consistency of the concrete. He even managed to carefully dig a small, shallow trench next to a non-visible portion of the foundation, just enough to expose a tiny corner and photograph the depth, then meticulously cover it back up. He was building his case. The next morning, as the city inspector's car pulled up, Arthur was waiting by his wall. He didn't see Brenda across the street, but he felt her eyes on him, a silent, expectant presence. He knew she was watching, waiting for the final blow. But Arthur Vance, the quiet librarian, had found a new chapter in his story, and it wasn't one of defeat. The city inspector, Mr. Harrison, was a man who looked perpetually unimpressed. He arrived precisely on time, a clipboard in hand, his gaze sweeping over Arthur's meticulously built cinder block wall with a practiced, dispassionate efficiency. Arthur stood ready, a binder of evidence clutched tight. Across the street, Brenda Carmichael had emerged from her house, ostensibly to water her roses, but her posture was rigid, her attention fixed solely on Arthur's property. This was her moment of triumph. "Mr. Vance," Mr. Harrison began, his voice flat. "We're here regarding a complaint about an unpermitted masonry structure. I'll need to see your plans, permits, and access to the foundation for inspection." Arthur stepped forward, calm despite the tremor in his hands. "Mr. Harrison, I understand the protocol. However, I believe this structure falls under a specific clause for non-load-bearing garden walls under 8 feet, which, according to the city code I've researched, doesn't require a full permit if certain material and construction standards are demonstrably met. I've done my homework." He opened his binder. "Firstly, here are the city code sections I referenced." He showed printouts, highlighted. "Secondly, this wall is precisely 8 feet tall, entirely on my property line, and is not load-bearing." Mr. Harrison's expression remained neutral, but he took the binder. "Demonstrably met, Mr. Vance, typically means stamped architectural plans and professional inspections at each phase, which you don't have." "Indeed," Arthur conceded. "But I do have evidence of meticulous construction and material integrity." He then pulled out the stack of empty concrete bags. "These are the bags from the concrete mix I used. Note the manufacturer, the high-strength rating, the batch numbers, and the precise mixing instructions I followed." He pointed to the date stamps, all within the period of construction. Mr. Harrison picked up a bag, his eyebrows rising fractionally. This was unusual. "Furthermore," Arthur continued, emboldened by the small sign of interest, "I understand concerns about rebar and foundation. While I can't exactly dismantle the wall for you, I've taken highly detailed photographs. Here you can see the rebar placement visible on the top course, conforming to code. And here," he paused, showing a photo of the briefly exposed corner of the foundation, "is a photo demonstrating the appropriate foundation depth and width, dug before the first course was laid." Mr. Harrison flipped through the photographs. They were amateur, yes, but undeniably clear. Arthur's meticulous nature, usually confined to cataloging old books, had extended to his construction project. He looked at the batch numbers on the concrete bags, then back at the wall, then at the photo of the foundation. Across the street, Brenda's jaw had slowly begun to drop. Her initial smugness had morphed into a look of confusion, then dawning horror. This wasn't going according to her plan. "I also have receipts for all materials, purchased from certified suppliers, proving their quality and origin," Arthur added, pulling out another organized stack of papers. "And if you wish, Mr. Harrison, I can walk you through the precise mixing ratios I used, the setting times, and the leveling techniques. I followed every guideline I could find, ensuring its safety and durability. I built this wall to last." Mr. Harrison walked along the wall, tapping it with his knuckles, running a hand over the mortar lines. He paused at the corner where Arthur had briefly exposed the foundation. He pulled out a small, specialized tool, a kind of depth gauge, and carefully inserted it into the small, recovered trench. He frowned slightly, pulling it back. Brenda, unable to bear the suspense, finally marched across the street. "What's going on, Mr. Harrison? Is he in violation or not? That monstrous thing needs to come down." Mr. Harrison turned slowly, his face still unreadable. "Mrs. Carmichael, I understand you filed the complaint." "Yes. It's unsightly. It's unsafe. It's a direct insult to community harmony," she declared, gesticulating wildly at the wall. Mr. Harrison then turned his gaze to Arthur, then back to the wall, then to Brenda. A long moment of silence hung in the air. Finally, he spoke. "Mr. Vance," Mr. Harrison said, his voice carrying, clearly across the quiet street, "your documentation is unusually thorough for a homeowner. Your construction appears to meet, if not exceed, the standards for a non-permitted masonry wall of this type. The foundation depth, as far as I can ascertain without destructive testing, is adequate. The material quality is verifiable. While this isn't ideal without a formal permit application beforehand, your evidence suggests a structurally sound build." Brenda gasped, a small, choked sound. Mr. Harrison then turned directly to Brenda. Mrs. Carmichael, while your concern for public safety is noted, this appears to be a well-built structure. And frankly, filing a complaint based on what appear to be fabricated or exaggerated technical deficiencies can result in wasting city resources and potential penalties for vexatious litigation. We will review Mr. Vance's documentation internally, but as of now there is no immediate order for demolition. We will, however, require a formal submission of your existing photographs and documentation for our records, Mr. Vance. He closed his clipboard with a decisive snap. Good day, Mr. Vance, Mrs. Carmichael. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. Arthur watched him go, a profound sense of relief washing over him, followed by a surge of quiet triumph. The wall stood. His fortress was secure. Brenda Carmichael stood on the sidewalk, utterly speechless, her face ashen. Her master plan, designed to crush Arthur, had not only failed, but had backfired spectacularly. Not only was the wall staying, but her manipulative tactics had been exposed, earning her a subtle but unmistakable rebuke from a city official. She stared at the unyielding gray barrier, then at Arthur, who simply offered her a small, knowing nod. The tables had turned. Hedges were gone, replaced by an unmovable,